Okay, welcome back. Arcadia, day 2. Last time, at the end of the video, I asked you to think about the research projects of Hannah and Bernard. So, what are they? And I have them here. Actually, I've added also Val's project because he too is an academic working on something which eventually he gives up. But let's just go through these 3 projects. So Hannah, and I've given you page numbers, at least for the edition that I ordered from the bookstore. If you have that, I have the page numbers for references if you want to look these up. But her project is to discover the identity of the hermit of Sidley Park with the intention of making him a symbol of the deterioration of the Enlightenment into Romanticism. Bernard's project is to prove that Byron had an affair with Mrs. Chater, then killed Mr. Chater in a duel, and then fled the country. It fits with the flamboyant personality of the poet Byron and with Romanticism's emphasis on passion. And then Val's project, which again he eventually gives up, is trying to find the equation for the graph of the date he has on grouse at Sidley Park. Now, the method of or approach of each of these people is insignificant too. Hannah and Val are both classically predisposed people, and they use a more scientific approach that is cool, calculated, and precise. They criticize Bernard for his lack of discipline and thoroughness. His, quote, visceral belief in himself. That's something that is said on page 54. He says about their approach that they have, quote, no guts. All right, so you get how that's a real romantic thing, to go with your heart, with your passion, and not with your head. So this is another reflection of the classical versus romantic tension. Look at Val's description of his initial approach. Of Bernard's initial, this is not Bernard, but this is Val's description of any researcher's initial approach on page 50. He says, quote, you start guessing what the right tune might be. You try to pick it out of the noise. You try this, you try that. You start to get something. It's half-baked, but you start putting in notes which are missing or not quite the right notes. And bit by bit, dum-de-dum-dum, dear Valentine, dum-de-dum-dum to you, the lost algorithm. All right, so this is really what Bernard is doing, but he doesn't continue until it's proved. He goes far enough by putting in, things that are missing, trying this and that, but then he goes far enough to presuppose that it must have happened, and that's enough for him. So if we go to the question of, who's right, who's wrong in all this, Bernard is exposed in the end to be wrong. But Hannah does discover the identity of the hermit of Sidley Park, who winds up being Septimus, of course, okay? And this is a bit of a spoiler, if you haven't gotten to the end yet, but we learn near the end of the play that Thomasina has died in a fire the night of her 17th birthday. And the last scene of the play has Thomasina and Septimus together just before she goes upstairs and then is killed. So it's a very sad ending in a way, because Thomasina is such a nice character. But yeah, so Septimus becomes the hermit of Sidley Park, and we don't really know a lot of the details except that he is said to be crazy, and that he has been doing things on paper, the spoiler part of this is that we don't really know what happens after Thomasina dies exactly, but Septimus must have gone crazy out of grief. We'll talk about this in the last video too. Grief or love or just the loss of such a great mind, and so what he is engaging in then is something of a combination of the iterated algorithms that Thomasina has discovered. So the drawings that Septimus does after she's dead has to do with the iterated logarithms. But it's also a combination of that, but also the second law of thermodynamics, and also the discussion of the steam engine, which we have in the last scene of the play too. Okay, and so like I'm the last person who should be trying to teach you about these mathematical and scientific issues, but I did want to spend just a minute or so about this business of the second law of thermodynamics. And this is not a great drawing that you have here, but the idea is that in a closed system, and I'm looking at this closed system here, that it, I mean, it's kind of complicated, but if you have things in a closed system, and you have things that are hot and things that are cold, there is going to be a transfer of heat. The hot and the cold are going to be kind of reduced to like lukewarm. And we have a couple of passages in the text coming up where they use analogies of coffee and tea to illustrate this. How, if you have coffee that's hot, you put cream in it and you still let it sit and it gets cold. This is basically the way that the second law works. But if you extend it to instead of a closed system like a box, to the universe instead, I mean, there are things that in the universe that kind of stir up heat and energy, but over time, if left to itself, the conclusion is that things will reduce to what we call complete entropy. And so entropy is that kind of like state of where all the energy, all the heat comes to rest. And that is also a sign of how all heat, all energy, all life will eventually dissipate. Wow, I can't believe I said all that without a scientific text in front of me. But the other point that comes up several times in the play is that hot always goes to cold. Cold can never go to hot. So there's only one direction, and it's toward entropy. If you want to learn more about this concept, there are a lot of short videos on YouTube. Well, there are a lot of long ones too, but you could find some short videos on YouTube to explain it. But also the website that I directed you to last time, if not reading some of the articles that are posted there, you might at least read each other's responses that I gave as an assignment last time to try to, to try to grapple with this idea of the second law of thermodynamics. I'll come back to some of these mathematical and scientific issues in the third video because they have a lot to do with what happens at the very end of the play. But the next thing I wanted to go into has to do with a number of interesting parallels that Stoppard has set up between the older time frame and the newer time frame. There are things that occur, and some of them I'm not sure even of how meaningful they are, but they make reference to each other, and I think in at least a couple of places are used for drawing our attention as viewers or readers to important concepts. Let me give you an example here. I mentioned in the second law business that tea and coffee references are used in the play to show how when you pour a cup of hot coffee, it will eventually get cold or room temperature, and then it doesn't go the other way around. And so the characters in both time frames make references to the scientific implications of this. Okay, so here are a couple of examples. This is very early in the play on page 9. And so I'm setting these off so that if you want page references to look these up on your own, that you can do that. This first one doesn't have so much to do with heat or cold, but with, I guess, color. Thomasina, who happens to be eating rice pudding, says, when you stir your rice pudding, Septimus, the spoonful of jam spreads itself round, making red trails like the picture of a meteor in my astronomical atlas. But if you stir backward, the jam will not come together again. Right, so like with heat and cold, once you stir the jam in, it spreads out in a pattern. But if you stir backwards, it becomes just pink and disordered. So there are scientific reasons for this, and this is kind of what Thomasina, as a 13-year-old child, is kind of putting together in a way that's very advanced. And then the second, and I didn't have it here, this is on page 52. And the second one, Valentine is the one who's speaking again. So it says, the universe, the elementary part of it, the ordinary sized stuff which is our lives, the things people write poetry about, clouds, daffodils, waterfalls, and what happens in a cup of coffee when the cream goes in. These things are full of mystery. And this third example, I think, is particularly significant, and it displays something that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, too, about places in the play where Stoppard is really trying to call our attention to something that seems to be important. It's a device, look at what Valentine says here, listen. And even just using the word listen is a way of saying, hey, everybody listen up, this is important. But listen, your tea's getting cold. Hannah says, I like it cold. And then Valentine says, I'm telling you something, okay? Everybody give me your attention. Your tea gets cold by itself. It doesn't get hot by itself. Do you think that's odd? No. Well, it is odd. Heat goes to cold. It's a one-way street. All right, so this has to do with that second law, that it only goes in one direction, and it's a scientific thing that dictates that. But the direction is from hot to cold always. What's happening to your tea is happening to everything everywhere, the sun and the stars. It'll take a while, but we're all going to end up at room temperature. All right, so that's the premise then of the second law, that everything is going to eventually go toward entropy, to disorder, and to room temperature. What I think is interesting about these parallels is how even at times when it doesn't seem like they're all that important, that they show up in both time frames, and sometimes only within a couple of pages of each other. And you think, well, why is he putting these two things together like this? I mean, it's funny, it's clever, but in this case, I don't think there's really much to it, except that he wants to echo in one of the time frames something else that happened in the other time frame, if you get what I mean. So in this first one, and this is on page 36. Hannah and Bernard are talking about their search for the various things. So somewhere in the Kroon papers there will be something. There isn't, Hannah says. I've looked. But you are looking for something else. It's not going to jump out at you like, quote, Lord Byron remarked wittily at breakfast. And then just a couple pages later, on page 40, Thomasina is talking, and it has to do actually with Byron having been at breakfast, and Thomasina noting that he said something amusing. So here, Lord Byron was amusing at breakfast. All right, so you put these two things together, and it's like, I don't know exactly why they're together, but the parallels just kind of jump out at you. Another example, these come from pages 76 and 79, and they have to do with this, not quite repeated, but so similar sentences. All right, so this is a really I think funny scene, but um, Miss Lady Croom has found out about Septimus um, having had carnal embrace with Mrs. Chater, but she also has found his letters that he left behind because he went to the duel, and if in case that he died, he left a letter for Lady Croom. Admitting his love for her. I mean, all this time he's been in love with her, and it's been referred to off and on, but not much has been said about it. Septimus, being the witty guy he is trying to get out of a bad situation, and he says, "My lady, I was alone with my thoughts in the gazebo when Mrs. Chater ran me to ground, and I, being in a passion, in an agony of unrelieved desire, uh, I thought in my madness that the Chater, with her skirts over her head, would give me the momentary illusion of the happiness to which I dared not put a face." It's pretty bold of him, isn't it? And she goes, "I do not know when I have received a more unusual compliment, Mr. Hodge." It is quite an unusual compliment. And then the second one, we have Valentine and Hannah, and they've had this kind of gag going on that Valentine thinks of Hannah as his fiancée, even though Hannah, sees it's a ridiculous thing. But he has some feelings for her apparently. But but he's saying, "Hey, can't we have a trial marriage and I'll call it off in the morning?" And then Hannah, amused, "I don't know when I've received a more unusual proposal." Again, so two different time frames, very similar language, and I do think that Stoppard is counting on us to say, "Hey, I heard that somewhere before. What was that line?" And what's the connection between these two lines? Well, I mean, a proposal and a compliment, they're not the same thing, but it is drawing attention to sexual situations. And I think that the next one is even more pronounced, and I think probably more significant to maybe what Stoppard is trying to get at in this play, or one of the things he's trying to get at in this play. Okay, this time the passages that I'm talking about are longer, so I had to get them on their own separate slides. But both of them, the attention-getting device is here again, a different sentence or phrase or a couple of different sentences. Look at this. Am I the first person to have thought of this? As Thomasina says. Without asking what it is that she thought, Septimus replies, "No." And she says, "I have not said yet." And Septimus spends a few lines trying to guess what it was that she was going to say. But then eventually she says, "No. If you could stop every atom in its position and direction, and if your mind could comprehend all the actions thus suspended, then if you were really, really good at algebra, you could write the formula for all the future. And although nobody can be so clever as to do it, the formula must exist just as if one could." Right, so this is a 13-year-old coming up with this Newtonian determinism of sorts here. And then a pause. "Yes, as far as I know, you are the first person to have thought of this." All right, so this is, I think, a significant moment. I mean, it certainly it helps establish Thomasina as a child prodigy. Septimus is clearly taken aback and impressed with her mind. And I forgot to mention that this is on page 9, right near the beginning of the play again. But in this second example, look at how similar the situation and the language are. This is page 77 and 78 at break. There's a page break, that's why it looks like this. And what makes this one particularly remarkable is that Valentine, of course, he's kind of like a Septimus, and he's really smart and well educated. But this time he's talking with Chloe, who is his sister, who is a really much more minor character and is not really credited with being well educated or particularly smart. She's best known for chasing Bernard around and trying to get him to have sex with her. But look at what she says here. Okay, but again, Valentine. Do you think I'm the first person to think of this? I mean, it's not exactly the same thing as what Thomasina says, but it's so similar. And you must be thinking, what is Stopper trying to do here? He's drawing our attention to it. And then Valentine's response, no. Okay, so Valentine, do you think I'm the first person to think of this? No. Exactly the same response that Septimus had without even listening to what her thought was. And again, just like Thomasino, I haven't said yet. So she says, the future is all programmed like a computer. That's a proper theory, isn't it? The deterministic universe, yes. Okay, which is very similar to what Thomasina was talking about in the previous example. Because everything, including us, is just a lot of atoms bouncing off each other like billiard balls. And then I skipped a little part, but I kind of thought that might be significant too. Valentine says, yes, there was someone, forget his name, 1820s, who pointed out that from Newton's laws you could predict everything to come. I mean, that's something that Thomasina said probably before that person said it. But then Chloe comes back and says, but it doesn't work, does it? And Valentine says, no, it turns out the maths is different. And she says, no, it's all because of sex. And Valentine is surprised and says, really? So then she says, all right, this is what I think. I think the universe is deterministic, all right, just like Newton said. I mean, it's trying to be, but the only thing going wrong is people fancying people who aren't supposed to be in that part of the plan. Right, so think about what that means, first of all, and we'll come back to that. And then Valentine says, the attraction that Newton left out, all the way back to the apple in the garden. Yes, I think you are the first person to think of this. So look at these two situations, how parallel in structure they are of the, am I the first person to think? No. And yes, I think you are. Clearly Valentine here has been impressed with what Chloe has just said. And I just want to come to this word fancying. Okay, so when Chloe says fancying, she means being attracted to, sexually. So it's kind of a British way of saying that. But I think, in the last video, I'm going to come back to this because this idea of attraction, of desire, it's not so much, again, about sex. I was saying that in the first video. I don't know if it's so much about sex, but the idea of desire, attraction, where does that come from? And that's something maybe to be asking yourself for next time, and we'll be coming back to it. There's another section on page 75 in which Lady Croom, who is also not well educated and not given that much credit for being so intelligent of a character in this play, but she does say at one point that it is a defect of God's humor that he directs our hearts everywhere but to those who have a right to them. She's talking about people who are not, who are married to other people perhaps, or should not be attracted to people because of class or because of they're married to somebody else. But she says, this is kind of like the state of human nature, that we can't really help ourselves sometimes. This is what, desire is about. We don't go out with the intention of falling in love with a person. It's something that happens to us, and it comes seemingly from nowhere. Okay, we'll talk more about that next time. All right, and so in the last thing I wanted to do in this second video is to ask you to be thinking about the character of Gus. Gus is also kind of a minor character, and he doesn't talk, so he doesn't have any lines, but there is another parallel with Gus, a double, in fact. So I'm looking here at the characters. Look here at the bottom, Gus Coverley and Augustus Coverley. So Augustus is Thomasina's brother. He's a very minor character, but both he and Gus in the second time frame are age 15. And I imagine that Gus must be short for Augustus, so they have the same name. Is there possibly a connection? And look at the next slide. At the beginning of the book, where it gives, and this is typical of plays, they let you know when the premiere of the play happened and who played what character. And I don't know if it has to be done this way, but I think it, in the two productions that I've seen of this play and other, I mean, I think this is the way they usually do it. The same character, the same actor, that was what I mean, is played. The same actor plays both Gus and Augustus. They are both to be is seen as similar. And in that last scene, when the two time frames are doubled up in the same one, and Gus, who is in the contemporary time frame, is like the other people in there, dressed up in costumes for their party from the Regency period. He, in fact, is going to be looking very much like Augustus. So what's the connection? He is with Septimus and Thomasina and Hannah dancing in the last scene. So there must be some significance to that. So maybe be thinking about what to make of Gus for our next session too, okay?